You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie and you think, thank God this is just fiction? Well, what I'm about to tell you will shatter that comfort forever. Because the Netflix series that kept you up at night, the one where desperate people play children's games for their lives, it actually happened. Not in some dystopian future, but in the 1980s, South Korea. And it was so much worse than anything Hollywood could imagine. Picture this. Thousands of people, including children as young as 4 years old, trapped in a massive compound in the middle of nowhere. They're wearing identical blue tracksuits, their heads shaved so brutally that scars cover their scalps. They have numbers instead of names. And every day, they're forced to play games, childhood games that have been twisted into instruments of torture and death. This isn't the plot of Squid Game. This is the true story that inspired it. The story of Brothers Home in South Korea, where an estimated 3,500 people were held captive, tortured, and killed. Where children were kidnapped off the streets for the crime of looking poor. Where families were torn apart and human beings were treated like animals. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. It was all legal. Sanctioned by the government, funded by taxpayers, all in the name of cleaning up for the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Let me take you back to February 2005, to a small town in South Korea where 14-year-old Choi is walking home from school. He's got a piece of bread in his backpack, left over from lunch that he's saving for dinner because his family can't afford much food. His father sells toilet paper door to door, which isn't exactly a lucrative business when most people still use newspaper. Suddenly, a hand grips Choi's shoulder and drags him into an alleyway. A middle-aged man is staring at him with cold eyes. "Did you steal that bread?" Choi tries to explain it's just leftovers from school. He's not a thief. But the man isn't listening. He rips open Choi's backpack, finds the bread, and his face twists with satisfaction. "I knew it. You little punk. Where did you steal this from?" What happens next is so disturbing that Choi, now in his 50s, still can't talk about it without shaking. The man forces him to strip naked in that alleyway. He holds a lighter to Choi's private parts, the flame dancing dangerously close to his skin. "Tell me the truth or I'll burn you." Choi is 14 years old. He's terrified, in pain, and completely alone. So he does what any child would do. He tells the man whatever he wants to hear. "Okay, fine. I stole it from the market." The man smiles. He makes a phone call, and within minutes, a white refrigerated truck screeches to a halt in front of the alleyway. The back door slides open, revealing complete darkness. Choi is thrown inside and the door slams shut. As his eyes adjust to the darkness, he sees them. Dozens of pairs of eyes staring back at him. Children, teenagers, adults, all crammed into this windowless truck like cargo. They've been driving for what feels like hours, going up a steep mountain road where branches scrape against the sides of the vehicle. When the truck finally stops and the doors open, Choi steps out into a nightmare that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He's standing in the middle of a massive compound, 60 concrete buildings arranged in a circle around a central field. It looks like a military base, but there's something wrong with it. The walls are 30 feet high with no handholds, no way to climb out. Guards with wooden clubs patrol the perimeter. And beyond the walls, nothing but dense forest stretching to the horizon. This is Brothers Home, though the name is a cruel joke. There's nothing brotherly about this place. It's a concentration camp disguised as a welfare facility, and Choi has just become prisoner number 2,167. The first thing they do is shave his head. Not carefully, not with any concern for his comfort. They grab chunks of his hair and hack it off at random lengths, leaving his scalp covered in cuts and scars. Then they force him to strip again, this time in front of hundreds of other prisoners, and hand him a blue tracksuit with his number sewn onto it. "From now on," a guard screams, "your only possessions are this tracksuit and one spare. If the zipper breaks, you make do. When winter comes and it's below freezing, you don't get a coat. This is your new life. Choi is sorted into what they call a platoon, one of the concrete buildings that houses dozens of people in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The building is filled with bunk beds stacked so close together you can barely walk between them. The smell is overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else. Something that smells like death. That first night, as Choi lies on his thin mattress listening to the sounds of crying and whimpering around him, he learns the rules of this place. You wake up at 5 a.m. to a military alarm. You have 3 seconds to wash your face with salt water. Now, no soap, no toothpaste, just salt that burns your skin and makes your mouth taste like blood. You march in formation to the central field for roll call. And if you're even slightly out of step, you get beaten with those wooden clubs. And then come the games. Who wants to play a game? The guards ask with twisted smiles. But these aren't games. They're torture disguised as childhood activities designed to break your spirit and sometimes your body. Take the Han River Bridge game. 50 people have to get down on their hands and knees in a line, each person putting their legs on the shoulders of the person behind them, creating a human bridge. Then the guards walk across this bridge of human bodies for 30 minutes or more. If anyone collapses, everyone gets beaten. If the bridge falls, people get trampled. Or there's Hiroshima, where everyone has to hang upside down from the top bunks like bats, blood rushing to their heads until they pass out. While they're hanging there, guards randomly hit them in the stomach with wooden sticks. The anticipation of not knowing when the blow will come is almost worse than the pain itself. Then there's the blanket roll. They wrap you in a blanket like a burrito and then kick you like a soccer ball. If you don't curl up fast enough to protect your head, you end up with a concussion. Many people never recover from the brain damage. But perhaps the cruelest game is cavalry, where they force 2 prisoners to fight each other until one is unconscious or near death. Sometimes it's children fighting children. Sometimes it's family members forced to beat each other bloody while guards laugh and place bets. Choi watches a boy having an epileptic seizure get beaten to death because the guards think he's faking it. He sees people's teeth pulled out one by one with pliers. He witnesses a man's stomach split open on a wire, his intestines spilling out. And instead of medical care, the guards pour salt into the wound. And through it all, the most horrifying realization, this isn't random violence. This is systematic, organized. There are detailed records, careful documentation, and a clear hierarchy. Someone is making money from this suffering. The guards aren't just sadistic, they're following orders. There are quotas to meet, reports to file, and a steady stream of new vagrants being delivered by police officers who get bonuses for each person they bring in. Because here's the thing that makes this story even more chilling. The people in Brother's home aren't criminals. They're not dangerous. They're just poor or homeless or in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like 12-year-old Jung, whose father sold toilet paper door to door and dreamed of his son becoming president someday. Jung was kidnapped from a subway station by 2 well-dressed men who told him they were police officers and needed to ask him some questions. Or the college student who fell asleep on a train and woke up in Brother's home because sleeping on public transportation was now classified as vagrant behavior. Or the man who glanced at a TV in a train station and was arrested because if he had a home, he'd watch TV there. You see, in preparation for the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the South Korean government decided they needed to clean up their image. They couldn't have foreign visitors seeing homeless people or anyone who looked undesirable. So they expanded the definition of vagrant to include basically anyone they wanted to disappear. Drinking in public? Vagrant. Looking unkempt? Vagrant. Being poor? Vagrant. And once you were labeled a vagrant, you could be sent to Brothers' home indefinitely, with no trial, no lawyer, no way to contact your family. The police were given quotas and bonuses for bringing in vagrants, but they couldn't just arrest random people. That would cause too much trouble. So they targeted people who wouldn't be missed. People whose families had no power, no money, no voice. Children from small towns, elderly people with no relatives, anyone who looked like they couldn't fight back. And Brothers' home wasn't the only facility. There were dozens of these places across South Korea, all operating under the same system, all funded by the government, all designed to make undesirable people disappear. But Brothers' home was the largest, the most profitable, and the most brutal. As Choi lies in his bunk that first night listening to the sounds of suffering around him, he makes himself a promise. If he survives this place, he'll tell the world what happened here. He'll make sure people know the truth about the games they were forced to play. He doesn't know it yet, but he'll be trapped in this nightmare for 5 years. 5 years of daily torture, of watching people die, of slowly losing pieces of his humanity just to survive. And he's one of the lucky ones. Because, unlike the estimated 600 people who died in Brothers' home, Choi will eventually make it out alive. But the question that haunts him, that should haunt all of us, is how something like this could happen. How could thousands of people be tortured and killed while the world looked the other way? How could a government not only allow this, but actively fund it? The answer is more terrifying than the crimes themselves, because Brothers' home didn't exist in some lawless wasteland or failed state. It existed in a country preparing to host the Olympics, a country trying to show the world how modern and civilized it had become. And that's just the beginning of this story. Because what happened inside Brothers' home was only possible because of a network of corruption, greed, and indifference that reached the highest levels of government and society. The real question isn't how Brothers' home could exist. The real question is, how many Brothers' homes exist right now in countries around the world, hidden behind bureaucracy and good intentions? How many people are playing deadly games at this very moment, while the rest of us go about our comfortable lives, never knowing they exist? The story of Brothers' home is a mirror reflecting the darkest possibilities of human nature and government power. And once you see that reflection, you can never unsee it. This is just the beginning. The games have only just started. Remember that promise Choi made to himself on his first night in Brothers' home? To tell the world what happened if he survived? Well, he kept that promise. And what he revealed about the dead bodies, about what they did with the hundreds of people who didn't make it out alive, will make you question everything you thought you knew about human decency. But first, let me tell you about the saltwater torture. Because if the games were designed to break your spirit, the salt water was designed to break your body from the inside out. Picture this. You're already starving, already dehydrated from the games and the constant fear. Your body is covered in wounds from the beatings, open cuts that won't heal in the filthy conditions. And then the guards come with buckets of salt water. Not to clean your wounds, that would be merciful. No, they force you to drink it. Han, the survivor who wrote the book our researchers translated, describes it like this. They would hold your nose shut and pour the salt water down your throat until you thought you would drown. Your stomach would cramp so violently you'd think your organs were tearing apart. And then, when you couldn't hold it down anymore, when you vomited it all back up, they'd make you drink it again. The salt water served multiple purposes, all of them cruel. It caused severe dehydration, making you so desperately thirsty that you'd drink anything, even contaminated water that would make you sick. It caused your kidneys to work overtime, leading to organ failure. And it made the beatings more painful because salt in open wounds is agony beyond description. But here's the truly diabolical part. They told the prisoners it was medicine. "This will cleanse the evil spirits from your body," the guards would say. "This will make you pure." Some people, desperate for any hope, actually believed it. They would beg for more salt water, thinking it would save them. Watching fellow prisoners volunteer for torture because they'd been convinced it was healing, that broke people's minds faster than any beating ever could. And when the saltwater torture wasn't enough, when people still clung to life despite everything, that's when they brought out the food torture. Now, I need to warn you. What I'm about to describe is so disturbing that even hardened investigators had trouble documenting it. But it's important that you know, because this is what systematic dehumanization looks like when it reaches its logical conclusion. The guards would prepare elaborate meals, not for the prisoners, but as props in their twisted theater of cruelty. They'd set up a dining table with the beautiful place settings, bowls and plates arranged perfectly. But instead of food, the bowls were filled with fulu, those talismanic papers, soaked in dirty water. And the plates, they were smeared with human feces. Then they'd force prisoners to sit at this table and pretend to eat, to go through the motions of a civilized meal while consuming waste and paper. Some prisoners, driven mad by starvation, would actually try to eat it. Others would refuse and be beaten until they complied. The psychological torture was the point. They weren't just trying to kill people. They were trying to destroy the very concept of human dignity, to reduce people to animals who would eat anything to survive. But even this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when people tried to escape. Because despite the 30-foot walls and the guards and the isolation, people did try to run. Desperation makes people attempt impossible things. And the punishment for trying to escape wasn't just death. It was being made an example of in front of everyone else. Choi witnessed one escape attempt during his second year at Brothers' home. A young man named Kim had been planning for months, studying the guard rotations, looking for weaknesses in the perimeter. He almost made it too. He got over the first wall using a rope made from torn clothing. But they caught him in the forest, brought him back, and what they did to him in the central courtyard while everyone was forced to watch. Choi still can't talk about it without breaking down. "They didn't just kill him," Choi told our researchers. "They unmade him, piece by piece, and they made us watch every second of it. They wanted us to know that death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to us." After Kim's punishment, escape attempts stopped almost entirely. The message was clear. There are fates worse than staying. But here's what the guards didn't count on. Some people would rather die than live as animals. And that's when the suicides started. People would throw themselves from the tops of buildings, hang themselves with torn clothing, or simply stop eating until their bodies gave out. The guards tried to prevent it, not out of compassion, but because dead prisoners couldn't work. They needed the labor force. So they instituted a buddy system. Prisoners were paired up and made responsible for each other's lives. If your buddy died by suicide, you would be tortured as punishment for failing to prevent it. This turned potential allies against each other, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and mistrust. But the most horrifying part of this story isn't the torture or the games or even the deaths. It's what happened to the bodies afterward. When someone died in Brothers' home, whether from the games, the torture, disease, or suicide, their body didn't get a proper burial. It didn't get returned to their family. It didn't even get recorded in any official death registry. Instead, the bodies were taken to what the guards called the processing center, a building at the far end of the compound that prisoners were never allowed to enter. What happened in that building remained a mystery for years, until a former guard finally broke his silence in 2019. The bodies were being sold, not for burial, not for medical research, but to medical schools and hospitals that needed cadavers for training. Brothers' Home had contracts with institutions across South Korea and even internationally. They were making money off the dead, just like they made money off the living. But it gets worse, much worse. The Guard revealed that they weren't just selling bodies that died naturally. When the demand was high and the supply was low, they would deliberately kill healthy prisoners and claim they died of illness. They had quotas to meet, contracts to fulfill. "We had a list," the Guard said in his testimony, names of prisoners who were suitable for processing, usually the ones who caused trouble or the ones who had no family looking for them. We'd wait for the right moment, then make it look like an accident or illness. The bodies were processed in that building, cleaned, preserved, and packaged for shipment. The families never knew. The institutions buying the bodies never asked questions. It was a perfect system of exploitation that continued even after death. And here's the part that will make you sick to your stomach. Some of those bodies were children. Remember, Brothers' Home housed people as young as 4 years old. When these children died from malnutrition, disease, or the brutal games, their small bodies were processed and sold just like the adults. Medical students across the country were unknowingly practicing on the corpses of murdered children. The financial records that were eventually uncovered show the scope of this operation. Brothers' Home was making more money from selling bodies than they were getting from the government subsidies. Death had become their most profitable product. But the body trade was just one part of a larger network of exploitation that reached far beyond the walls of Brothers' Home. Because while thousands of people were being tortured and killed, there was another operation running in parallel, one that targeted the youngest and most vulnerable prisoners: the adoption scam. You see, when very young children were brought to Brothers' Home, kids under 5 or 6 years old, they weren't always kept with the general population. Instead, they were separated and taken to a special section of the compound that was kept clean and well maintained. These children were being prepared for international adoption. Foreign couples, mostly from the United States and Europe, were told they were adopting Korean orphans who needed loving homes. They paid thousands of dollars in fees, went through extensive background checks, and waited months or even years for their adoptions to be approved. What they didn't know was that many of these orphans weren't orphans at all. They were children who had been kidnapped from their families and brought to Brothers' Home. Their parents were often still alive, desperately searching for their missing children, never knowing they'd been shipped off to another country. The adoption agency would create false documents, fake birth certificates, and elaborate backstories for these children. They'd claim the parents had died in accidents or abandoned the children due to poverty. The foreign families had no way of knowing the truth. One survivor, now in his 50s, told our researchers about watching his 4-year-old sister being taken away for special care. He never saw her again. Decades later, he discovered she'd been adopted by a family in California who believed they were saving an orphan. She grew up never knowing she had a brother who spent years in hell looking for her. The adoption scam generated millions of dollars in revenue and helped maintain Brothers' Home's facade as a legitimate welfare institution. After all, what could be more humanitarian than finding homes for orphan children? But the cruelest irony is that while these young children were being sold to loving families abroad, their older siblings and parents were being tortured and killed just a few buildings away. The whole system was designed to maximize profit while maintaining plausible deniability. The government could point to the adoption program as evidence that Brothers' Home was doing good work. The international community saw Korea as a country that cared for its most vulnerable citizens, and the money kept flowing. Meanwhile, families were being destroyed in the most systematic way imaginable. Parents would lose their children to the adoption scam, then be tortured to death in the games. Siblings would be separated forever, with some shipped overseas and others buried in unmarked graves. And through it all, the games continued. Every day, new prisoners would arrive to replace the ones who died. The wooden clubs would crack against skulls, the salt water would burn throats. The human bridges would collapse under the weight of guards' boots. But here's what the people running Brothers' Home didn't anticipate. Some of the prisoners were keeping records. Secret diaries written on scraps of paper and hidden in the walls. Names of the dead scratched into concrete. Testimonies whispered from bunk to bunk and memorized by those who survived. They thought they could make people disappear without a trace. They thought they could erase entire families from existence. They thought the dead couldn't speak. They were wrong. Because every name that was remembered, every story that was preserved, every witness who survived became a thread in a web of evidence that would eventually bring the whole system crashing down. But that reckoning was still years away. And in the meantime, the games continued. The bodies piled up. And somewhere in the administrative offices of Brothers' Home, people in suits were counting money and planning for expansion. Because business was good, demand was high, and there were always more vagrants to be found on the streets of South Korea. The only question was, how long could they keep playing these deadly games before someone powerful enough to stop them finally decided to pay attention? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, but not before the body count reached numbers that would shock even the investigators who eventually uncovered the truth. This is just the beginning of the end. The games are about to get deadlier, and the people responsible are about to learn that some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. You want to know the most chilling part about Brothers' Home? It wasn't run by psychopaths or sadistic criminals. It was run by businessmen, people who wore suits, attended meetings, and filed quarterly reports. People who saw human suffering as a line item on a spreadsheet and torture as a cost-effective management strategy. And at the very top of this pyramid of horror sat a man who would make the front man from Squid Game look like a saint. His name was Park In-kun, and he didn't just run Brothers' Home. He built an empire of human misery that stretched across South Korea and reached into the highest levels of government. But before we meet the architect of this nightmare, let me tell you about what happened when families started looking for their missing loved ones, because that's when the true scope of this conspiracy began to reveal itself. Remember Jung, the 12-year-old whose father sold toilet paper? When Jung disappeared from that subway station, his father didn't just file a missing person report and wait. He spent every penny he had searching for his son. He hired private investigators, put up posters, even traveled to other cities following false leads. And he wasn't alone. Across South Korea, families were desperately searching for relatives who had simply vanished. Children who never came home from school, adults who went out for a job interview and were never seen again. Elderly people who disappeared during routine errands. The families would go to the police, but the police would just shrug. Your son was probably a vagrant, they'd say. Vagrants move around a lot. He'll turn up eventually. But when pressed for details about where these vagrants were taken, the police would become evasive. That's classified information, national security. Some families hired lawyers, but the lawyers hit the same wall. Brothers' Home was classified as a social welfare facility under government protection. The records were sealed. No visitors were allowed. No outside inspections were permitted. It was as if their loved ones had been erased from existence. But Jung's father was stubborn. He kept digging, kept asking questions, kept following paper trails that led nowhere. And eventually, he found something that changed everything. A former guard from Brothers' Home who was willing to talk. The guard's name was Lee, and he'd worked at Brothers' Home for 3 years before quitting in disgust. What he told Jung's father was so horrifying that at first, Jung's father didn't believe it. "Your son isn't missing," Lee said. "He's in hell, and if you want to save him, you need to understand what you're really fighting against." Lee explained that Brothers' Home wasn't just a welfare facility, it was a business empire. And like any successful business, it had multiple revenue streams. First, there was the government funding. Brothers Home received substantial subsidies for every person they housed, supposedly to provide food, shelter, and rehabilitation services. But instead of spending that money on the prisoners, they pocketed most of it while keeping people in conditions worse than most animal shelters. Second, there was the forced labor. The prisoners weren't just being tortured for fun. They were being used as unpaid workers in factories, farms, and construction sites. Companies would pay Brothers Home for access to this slave labor force, and the prisoners would work 12-hour shifts for no wages while being beaten if they didn't meet quotas. Third, there was the body trade we discussed earlier. Dead prisoners were worth more than living ones in some cases, especially if they were young and healthy. Fourth, there was the adoption scam, which generated enormous profits from desperate foreign families. But the fifth revenue stream was the most disturbing of all, the entertainment industry. You see, the wealthy and powerful people who funded Brothers Home didn't just want a return on their investment. They wanted to be entertained. And what could be more entertaining than watching desperate people fight for their lives? Lee told Young's father about the special events that were held at Brothers Home. VIP guests would arrive in expensive cars, dressed in fine clothes, carrying briefcases full of cash. They would be escorted to a private viewing area overlooking the central courtyard where they could watch the games in comfort. But these weren't the regular daily games designed to break prisoners' spirits. These were elaborate spectacles designed to thrill an audience. Prisoners would be forced to fight to the death, while wealthy spectators placed bets on the outcomes. Children would be made to compete in deadly versions of playground games, while their parents were forced to watch. The most popular event was called Family Day, where family members who had been separated were reunited in the courtyard, only to be told that they had to fight each other. The winner would be allowed to live. The loser would be killed in front of their loved ones. Young's father listened to all of this in stunned silence. Then he asked the question that was burning in his mind. Who are these people? Who would pay to watch children die? Lee's answer was a list of names that read like a who's who of South Korean society. Politicians, judges, business leaders, celebrities, even some foreign diplomats. People who presented themselves as pillars of the community while secretly funding the torture and murder of innocent people. They don't see the prisoners as human, Lee explained. To them, it's just entertainment, like watching gladiators in ancient Rome. They've convinced themselves that these people are worthless anyway, so why not make some money and have some fun? But the mastermind behind it all was Park In-kyun, the director of Brothers Home. Park wasn't just running a welfare facility. He was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars in revenue while maintaining the facade of humanitarian work. Park had started small, with a single facility and a handful of prisoners, but he had vision. He understood that there was enormous demand for what he was offering, a way for society to dispose of its undesirable elements while generating profit and entertainment for the wealthy. So he expanded. He opened new facilities across the country. He developed relationships with police departments, offering them bonuses for bringing in more vagrants. He cultivated politicians who would protect his operations in exchange for campaign contributions and other favors. Most importantly, he understood the power of legitimacy. Brothers Home wasn't presented as a prison or a labor camp. It was marketed as a progressive social welfare program. Park would give interviews to newspapers talking about his mission to help society's most vulnerable people. He would invite carefully selected journalists for tours of the facility, showing them clean dormitories and happy prisoners who had been coached on what to say under threat of death. The international community praised South Korea for its innovative approach to social welfare. Brothers Home was held up as a model that other countries should emulate. Park received awards for his humanitarian work. all while thousands of people were being tortured and killed just out of sight of the cameras. But Park's greatest achievement wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the system he created to ensure his operations could continue indefinitely. He understood that the key to long-term success wasn't just avoiding detection, but making detection impossible. So he corrupted the very institutions that were supposed to protect people. Police officers became his recruiters. Judges dismissed any legal challenges to his operations. Government officials buried any investigations. Medical examiners falsified death certificates. Social workers looked the other way. He created a web of complicity so vast and so deep that exposing Brothers' Home would require exposing the corruption of dozens of powerful institutions. And who would have the power to do that? Who would even want to, when so many important people had so much to lose? The answer came from an unexpected source: the prisoners themselves. You see, while Park had thought of everything, he had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that people who had been reduced to the level of animals would lose their humanity entirely. He thought that after enough torture, enough degradation, enough horror, the prisoners would become empty shells incapable of resistance. He was wrong. Even in the depths of Brothers' Home, even after years of unimaginable suffering, some prisoners held onto something that Park couldn't break: their determination to bear witness, to remember, to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. They developed an underground network of communication, passing information from building to building through coded messages and secret signals. They memorized the names of the dead, the faces of the guards, the details of the crimes they witnessed. They created a hidden archive of testimony that existed only in their minds, but was more detailed and accurate than any official record. And they waited. They endured. They survived. Because they knew that someday, somehow, someone would listen to their stories. That someone turned out to be Jung's father. Armed with the information from Lee, the former guard, Jung's father began building a case. He contacted other families of missing people. He gathered evidence. He documented the connections between Brothers' Home and the powerful people who protected it. But most importantly, he found a way to get a message to his son inside the facility. The message was simple: hold on. Help is coming. Tell everyone to remember everything. Jung received that message on a cold winter morning in 1986, 2 years after he'd been kidnapped. He was no longer the bright-eyed boy who had dreamed of becoming president. He was a broken teenager who had witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But when he got that message, something inside him rekindled. Hope, purpose, the knowledge that he wasn't forgotten. He began organizing the other prisoners, creating a systematic effort to document everything that was happening. They assigned different people to remember different aspects of the operation: who the guards were, which VIPs visited, what happened during the special events where the bodies were taken. They turned their shared trauma into a weapon of truth, and slowly, carefully, they began to fight back. Not with violence. They had learned that violence only brought more suffering, but with something more powerful than any weapon: the determination to ensure that their stories would survive, even if they didn't. They were creating the evidence that would eventually bring down Park In-kyun and his empire of horror. They were building the case that would expose the corruption that reached into the highest levels of South Korean society. They were preparing for a reckoning that was still years away, but was now inevitable. Because Park had made one fatal error in his calculations, he had assumed that broken people couldn't fight back. He had forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is someone who has nothing left to lose except the truth. And the truth, as they say, has a way of coming to light. But before that reckoning could come, the games would get deadlier, the stakes would get higher, and the people responsible would make one last desperate attempt to bury their secrets forever. The question was, would the prisoner's hidden archive of truth survive long enough to see justice? Or would Park and his allies find a way to silence the witnesses once and for all? The answer would determine not just the fate of the people trapped in Brothers' home, but the future of an entire country that had allowed this nightmare to exist in plain sight. The endgame was about to begin, and this time the stakes weren't just life and death. They were truth and lies, justice and corruption, humanity and monstrosity. The real games were just getting started. What happens when the people running a torture facility realize that their victims are organizing against them? What happens when the guards discover that the prisoners they thought they'd broken are actually building a case that could destroy everything? The answer is simple. They escalate. They make the games deadlier. They eliminate the witnesses, and they prepare for war. Park In-kyun wasn't stupid. He had informants among the prisoners, guards who reported suspicious behavior, and a network of surveillance that would make a police state jealous. So when word reached him that the prisoners were organizing, that they were documenting crimes and passing messages, he didn't panic. He smiled. Because Park had been preparing for this possibility from the very beginning, he had contingency plans, backup systems, and most importantly, he had powerful friends who would do anything to protect their investments. The crackdown began on a Tuesday morning in March 1987. Young woke up to the sound of boots marching across the courtyard. Not the usual guards, but Special Forces soldiers in full combat gear. They weren't there to play games. They were there to send a message. The soldiers surrounded the central courtyard and forced every prisoner to kneel in the dirt. Then Park himself appeared, flanked by men in expensive suits who Young had never seen before. These weren't guards or administrators. These were the real power behind Brothers' home, the wealthy investors who had been funding this nightmare from the shadows. Park walked slowly through the rows of kneeling prisoners, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "I understand there's been some confusion about your purpose here," he said. "Some of you seem to think you're political prisoners or witnesses to some great injustice. Let me clarify something for you." He stopped in front of Young, looking down at the teenager with cold eyes. "You are not prisoners. You are not victims. You are products, inventory, resources to be managed and disposed of as I see fit, and products that become defective." He gestured to the soldiers. "Well, defective products get recalled." What happened next was a systematic purge designed to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to the operation. The soldiers had lists, names of prisoners who had been identified as potential leaders or troublemakers. One by one, these people were dragged away. But Park's cruelty went beyond simple elimination. He wanted to break the spirit of resistance entirely. So he didn't just kill the organizers, he made their deaths into a new game. They called it the loyalty test. Here's how it worked. Prisoners suspected of organizing were brought to the center of the courtyard. Their family members, if any were also imprisoned at Brothers' home, were brought out to watch. Then the suspected organizer was given a choice. They could confess to their crimes against the facility, name their co-conspirators, and reveal everything they knew about the resistance network. If they did this, they would be killed quickly and their family members would be spared. Or they could remain silent, in which case they would be tortured to death slowly while their loved ones were forced to participate in the torture. Jung watched in horror as a man named Kim, one of the prisoners who had been helping to document the crimes, was subjected to this test. Kim's teenage daughter was also imprisoned at Brothers' home, and she was brought out to watch as the guards began their work on her father. They started with the saltwater torture, forcing Kim to drink bucket after bucket until he was vomiting blood. When he still refused to talk, they moved to the burning, using heated metal rods to brand symbols into his skin while his daughter screamed. But Kim held out. even as they broke his fingers one by one, even as they poured acid into his wounds, even as they did things that Jung still can't bring himself to describe, Kim never gave up a single name. He died protecting the resistance network, and his last words were a message to his daughter. Remember everything. Tell everyone. Make them pay. The guards killed his daughter immediately afterward, claiming she was contaminated by her father's defiance. This scene was repeated dozens of times over the following weeks. The courtyard became a theater of horror, where loyalty was tested and resistance was crushed. But Park had miscalculated again. Instead of breaking the prisoner's spirit, the purge only strengthened their resolve. Every death became a rallying cry. Every act of brutality became evidence to be remembered and documented. The resistance network didn't collapse, it evolved. The survivors developed new methods of communication that were virtually undetectable. They created codes based on the timing of coughs, the arrangement of personal belongings, even the way they walked across the courtyard. They turned their shared trauma into a language that only they could understand. And they began planning something that had never been attempted before at Brothers' home, a mass escape. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. During the next special event, when VIP guests would arrive to watch the games, the prisoners would stage a coordinated uprising. They would overwhelm the guards, break open the gates, and flood into the surrounding countryside before reinforcements could arrive. But more importantly, they would capture evidence. They would take photographs of the VIP guests, steal documents from the administrative offices, and gather proof of the crimes that had been committed. Even if most of them died in the attempt, some would escape with evidence that could expose the entire operation. The plan required precise timing, absolute coordination, and incredible courage. It also required sacrifices that would haunt the survivors forever. Jung was chosen to be one of the escapees, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he was young and had the best chance of surviving long enough to tell the story. He would carry the names of the dead, the details of the crimes, and the identities of the perpetrators. But first, they had to survive long enough to execute the plan. The weeks leading up to the escape attempt were the deadliest in Brothers' Home's history. Park, sensing that something was brewing, increased the frequency and brutality of the games. The daily death toll rose from a handful to dozens. The guards became more paranoid, more violent, more unpredictable. New games were introduced, each more horrific than the last. There was the human pyramid, where prisoners were forced to climb on top of each other to reach a piece of bread hanging from the ceiling, with the understanding that anyone who fell would be beaten to death. There was musical chairs with a deadly twist. When the music stopped, anyone left standing would be shot. But the most diabolical new game was called the Truth Serum. Prisoners would be injected with experimental drugs that were supposed to make them more compliant and talkative. The drugs were provided by pharmaceutical companies that were using Brothers' Home as an illegal testing ground for substances that were too dangerous to test on volunteers. The effects were horrific. Some prisoners would become catatonic, staring blankly into space for hours. Others would become violently aggressive, attacking anyone nearby. Still, others would experience hallucinations so vivid that they would try to claw their own eyes out. But the worst effect was on the children. The drug seemed to accelerate aging in young bodies, causing children to develop the physical symptoms of elderly people: gray hair, wrinkled skin, failing organs. Jung watched 8-year-olds die of what appeared to be old age, their small bodies unable to process the chemical cocktails being pumped into them. The pharmaceutical companies paid handsomely for access to this human testing ground, and Park was happy to provide subjects. After all, most of the prisoners were going to die anyway. Why not make some money from their suffering? But the drug experiments served another purpose. They were Park's insurance policy. You see, Park knew that eventually someone might investigate Brothers' Home. someone might ask uncomfortable questions about what happened to all those missing people. And when that day came, he wanted to be able to point to a facility full of mentally ill, drug-addled prisoners who couldn't give coherent testimony about anything. These people are clearly insane, he would say. They're delusional. They make up wild stories about torture and murder because their minds have been destroyed by years of drug abuse and mental illness. You can't believe anything they say. It was the perfect cover-up. Turn the witnesses into unreliable narrators. Make their testimony so bizarre and incoherent that no one would believe them. Even if they escaped, even if they tried to tell their stories, who would take the word of a mentally ill drug addict over the word of respected government officials and business leaders? But Park had underestimated the prisoners once again. Even as the drugs ravaged their bodies and minds, even as they watched their fellow prisoners descend into madness, the core group of organizers found ways to resist. They developed techniques for fighting off the effects of the drugs. Meditation practices, mental exercises, ways of anchoring their consciousness to reality, even as the chemicals tried to tear it apart. They learned to fake the symptoms of compliance while secretly maintaining their sanity. And they continued planning the escape. The date was set for April 15th, 1987, the day of the biggest special event of the year. Park had promised his VIP guests something spectacular, a recreation of the ancient Roman gladiator games, with prisoners fighting to the death using makeshift weapons. Over 200 wealthy spectators were expected to attend, including several high-ranking government officials and foreign dignitaries. The security would be focused on protecting the guests, not watching the prisoners. It was the perfect opportunity. But 3 days before the planned escape, disaster struck. One of the prisoners, a man named Lee, who had been acting strangely since receiving the experimental drugs, suddenly broke down during a routine game. He began screaming about escape plans, naming names, revealing details that only someone inside the resistance network could know. The guards immediately seized him and dragged him away for interrogation. Within hours, they had extracted everything: the date of the escape, the methods of communication, the names of the organizers. The purge that followed made the previous crackdown look gentle by comparison. Jung watched helplessly as his friends and fellow conspirators were dragged away one by one. Some were killed immediately. Others were subjected to torture so extreme that death became a mercy. The resistance network that had taken months to build was destroyed in a single night. But even in defeat, the prisoners had one last card to play. Because while Park thought he had crushed the resistance, he had actually done something far more dangerous. He had created martyrs. And martyrs, as any student of history knows, are far more powerful than living rebels. The stories of the prisoners who died protecting the resistance spread throughout Brothers' home like wildfire. Their names became rallying cries. Their courage became inspiration. Their sacrifice became proof that even in the darkest places, humanity could survive. And somewhere in the ruins of the failed escape plan, a new kind of resistance was being born. Not one based on physical rebellion, but on something far more dangerous to Park and his allies: the absolute determination to bear witness. The prisoners who survived the purge made a collective decision. They would not try to escape. They would not try to fight back. Instead, they would do something that Park couldn't stop, couldn't prevent, and couldn't control. They would remember everything, every name, every face, every crime, every detail of every atrocity they witnessed. They would turn their minds into an archive of evidence that no amount of torture could erase. And they would wait. However long it took, however much they had to endure, they would wait for their chance to tell the world what had happened in this place. Because they understood something that Park, for all his intelligence and planning, had never grasped. The truth doesn't need to escape to survive. It just needs to be remembered. And in the depths of Brothers' home, Surrounded by death and madness and unspeakable cruelty, the truth was very much alive. The question was, how long could it survive? And when the time came to speak, would anyone be left alive to tell it? The answers to those questions would determine not just the fate of Brothers' Home, but the future of everyone who had ever profited from its existence. The endgame was approaching, and this time there would be no escape for anyone. You know what's worse than being tortured? Being forgotten. And that's exactly what Park In-kun was counting on as he prepared for the final phase of his plan, the complete erasure of Brothers' Home and everyone who had ever been inside it. Because by 1987, Park had a problem. The Seoul Olympics were just 1 year away, and international attention on South Korea was intensifying. Foreign journalists were asking uncomfortable questions about the country's human rights record. Human rights organizations were requesting access to welfare facilities, and some very powerful people were getting nervous about their investments in Brothers' Home. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Make the entire facility disappear. Not just shut it down. That would leave too many loose ends, too many witnesses, too many records that could surface later. No, Park's plan was far more thorough. He was going to eliminate every trace that Brothers' Home had ever existed, starting with the people who could testify about what happened there. The plan was called Operation Clean Slate, and it began with a lie that was so audacious, so perfectly crafted, that even some of the guards believed it. Park announced to his staff that Brothers' Home was being upgraded to a modern rehabilitation facility. The current prisoners would be transferred to other institutions across the country where they would receive proper medical care and job training. It was a humanitarian gesture, he explained, a sign of South Korea's commitment to progressive social welfare. The guards were told they would be reassigned to other positions within the government. The administrative staff were promised generous severance packages. Everyone would benefit from this transition to a more humane system. Of course, it was all lies. The real plan was to systematically murder every prisoner in Brothers' Home, dispose of their bodies, and then demolish the facility. The guards who knew too much would have accidents. The administrative staff would disappear. The records would be destroyed, and the land would be sold to developers who would build luxury apartments on top of the mass graves. But Park needed time to execute this plan properly. He couldn't just kill 3,500 people overnight without attracting attention. So he began what he called the gradual reduction process. First, he increased the lethality of the games. What had once been torture designed to break spirits became murder disguised as entertainment. The daily death toll rose from dozens to hundreds. Bodies were removed so quickly that many prisoners never even knew their friends had died. They would simply disappear between one meal and the next. Second, he began transferring prisoners to what he called satellite facilities, smaller compounds scattered throughout the mountains of South Korea. These facilities had no guards, no games, no pretense of being welfare institutions. They were simply killing fields where prisoners were executed en masse and buried in unmarked graves. Third, he accelerated the medical experiments. The pharmaceutical companies were told they had a limited time to complete their testing, so they began using increasingly lethal doses of experimental drugs. Entire buildings of prisoners were used as test subjects for chemical weapons, biological agents, and psychological warfare techniques. Jung watched this systematic extermination with growing horror. Every day, more of his friends vanished. Every night, he could hear the sounds of construction equipment digging new graves in the forest surrounding the compound. The smell of burning bodies became so constant that the guards started wearing masks. But the most terrifying part wasn't the killing. It was the efficiency. Park had turned mass murder into an industrial process, complete with quotas, schedules, and quality control measures. He had spreadsheets tracking the disposal of human beings like they were defective products being recalled from the market. And through it all, he maintained the facade of humanitarian reform. He gave interviews to newspapers about the exciting changes coming to South Korea's social welfare system. He hosted tours for foreign dignitaries, showing them the empty buildings that were being prepared for renovation. He even received a commendation from the government for his innovative approach to prisoner rehabilitation. The international community praised South Korea's progressive reforms. Human rights organizations noted the apparent improvement in conditions at welfare facilities. The Olympic Committee expressed satisfaction with the country's commitment to social justice, all while thousands of people were being systematically murdered just out of sight of the cameras. But Park had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had assumed that the prisoners who remained were too broken, too traumatized, too drugged to pose any threat. He thought that years of torture had reduced them to empty shells incapable of resistance. He was wrong. Because while Park had been planning Operation Clean Slate, the surviving prisoners had been planning something of their own. They called it Operation Last Witness. The plan was simple. If they were all going to die anyway, they would make sure their deaths served a purpose. They would create evidence that couldn't be destroyed, testimony that couldn't be silenced, proof that would survive even if they didn't. Jung became the coordinator of this final resistance effort. At 19 years old, he had spent 5 years in Brothers' home and had witnessed horrors that would have broken most adults. But instead of breaking him, the experience had forged him into something harder than steel, a living archive of truth that no amount of torture could corrupt. Working with the other survivors, Jung began creating what they called the permanent record. Using techniques they had developed over years of secret communication, they began encoding the complete history of Brothers' home into forms that could survive the destruction of the facility. They carved names into the concrete foundations of buildings, knowing that even if the structures were demolished, the foundations would remain. They created coded messages using the arrangement of stones in the courtyard, patterns that would look random to casual observers, but contained detailed information about the crimes committed there. Most importantly, they began preparing human witnesses who could carry the truth beyond the walls of Brothers' home. The plan required incredible sacrifice. The strongest and most knowledgeable prisoners would stay behind to maintain the resistance network and protect the evidence. But a select few, the youngest, the healthiest, the ones most likely to survive, would be prepared for escape attempts during the final phase of Operation Clean Slate. Jung was chosen to be one of these witnesses. He spent weeks memorizing every detail of the facility's layout, every name of every guard, every face of every VIP who had visited. He learned the real names of the pharmaceutical companies that had conducted experiments, the government officials who had provided protection, the business leaders who had invested in the operation. He became a walking database of evidence that could bring down not just Park In-kyun, but the entire network of corruption that had made Brothers' home possible. But preparing for escape was only half the battle. The other half was surviving long enough to attempt it. As Operation Clean Slate accelerated, the conditions in Brothers' home became apocalyptic. The guards, knowing they would soon be eliminated themselves, became increasingly brutal and unpredictable. Some began killing prisoners for sport. Others started hoarding supplies for their own planned escapes. The facility descended into chaos. Buildings were abandoned as their populations were transferred to the killing fields. The remaining prisoners were crowded into smaller and smaller spaces, with dozens of people crammed into rooms designed for a handful. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded buildings. Cholera, typhus, and other infections killed people faster than the guards could dispose of the bodies. The smell of death became so overwhelming that even the rats began abandoning the facility. But the worst part was the psychological warfare. Park began playing recordings of the voices of dead prisoners over the facility's loudspeaker system. He would broadcast the final screams of people who had been tortured to death, the last words of children calling for their parents, the desperate pleas of people begging for mercy. The message was clear. Resistance is futile. Everyone dies in the end. Hope is just another form of torture, but Jung and the other survivors refused to break. They had seen too much, lost too much, endured too much to give up now. They knew that their deaths were inevitable, but they also knew that their deaths could have meaning if they could just get the truth out. The opportunity came sooner than expected. In December 1987, just 8 months before the Seoul Olympics, a group of foreign journalists arrived in South Korea to do preliminary reporting on the country's preparations for the Games. One of these journalists was an American named Sarah Chen, who had been investigating reports of human rights abuses in South Korean welfare facilities. Chen had been trying to gain access to Brothers' home for months, but had been repeatedly denied by government officials who claimed the facility was undergoing renovations. But Chen was persistent, and she had sources within the South Korean government who were growing uncomfortable with what they knew about Park's operations. One of these sources, a mid-level bureaucrat who had been involved in the early planning for Brothers' home, but had been horrified by what it had become, agreed to help Chen gain unauthorized access to the facility. The plan was risky for everyone involved. If Chen was caught, she would likely be arrested and deported, ending her career. If the bureaucrat was discovered, he would probably be killed. And if the prisoners were found helping a foreign journalist, they would face tortures that would make their previous suffering look merciful. But they all understood that this might be their only chance to expose the truth before Operation Clean Slate was completed. On the night of December 15, 1987, Sarah Chen and her cameraman were smuggled into Brothers' home through a maintenance tunnel that connected the facility to a nearby water treatment plant. They had exactly 2 hours to document what they found before the morning shift change would make their presence impossible to hide. What they discovered in those 2 hours would change everything. Chen's camera captured images that would haunt viewers around the world. Emaciated prisoners huddled in freezing concrete cells, children with the hollow eyes of trauma victims, mass graves filled with hundreds of bodies, medical laboratories where human experimentation was conducted without anesthesia. But more importantly, Chen was able to interview Jung and several other survivors who had been preparing for this moment for months. In whispered conversations conducted in the darkness of abandoned buildings, they told her everything: the names, the dates, the details of crimes that defied human comprehension. Jung handed Chen a small piece of paper that contained the most damning evidence of all: a complete list of the VIP guests who had attended the special events at Brothers' home. The list included government ministers, Supreme Court justices, corporate executives, and even some foreign diplomats. "This is everyone who paid to watch us die," Jung whispered. "Make them pay for what they did." Chen and her cameraman escaped from Brothers' home just as the morning alarm was sounding. They had 2 hours of footage and dozens of pages of testimony that would expose one of the most horrific crimes in modern history. But getting the evidence out of South Korea would prove to be almost as dangerous as gathering it, because Park and Kun had allies everywhere, and they would do anything to prevent this story from reaching the outside world. The hunt for Sarah Chen and her evidence was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If Chen succeeded in getting her story published, it would bring down governments, destroy careers, and expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of South Korean society. If she failed, the evidence would be destroyed, the witnesses would be killed, and Brothers' home would disappear forever, taking its secrets to the grave. The race against time had begun, and the future of everyone who had ever been touched by Brothers' home hung in the balance. The truth was finally free. The question was, would it survive long enough to see the light of day? Sarah Chen had 48 hours to get out of South Korea before Park In-kyun's network realized what she had discovered. 48 hours to smuggle out evidence that could topple a government and expose crimes that defied human comprehension. And she was being hunted by people who had already proven they would kill thousands to protect their secrets. The chase began at 6 a.m. on December 16, 1987, when Park's security team discovered that someone had breached Brothers' home during the night. They found footprints in the mud, cigarette butts that didn't match the brands smoked by the guards, and most damning of all, a small piece of camera equipment that had been dropped during the hasty escape. Park didn't panic. He had been preparing for this possibility for years. Within minutes, he activated what he called Protocol 7, a comprehensive plan to contain any security breach and eliminate all evidence of the facility's true purpose. The first step was lockdown. Every road leading away from Brothers' home was blocked by police checkpoints. Every airport, train station, and bus terminal in the region was flooded with security personnel. Every hotel, guest house, and safe house that might harbor foreign journalists was searched. The second step was disinformation. Park's media contacts began spreading stories about a terrorist attack on a government welfare facility. Foreign journalists were warned that dangerous criminals had escaped and were threatening public safety. The entire region was declared a security zone where unauthorized personnel would be arrested on sight. The third step was elimination. The bureaucrat who had helped Chen gain access to Brothers' home was found dead in his apartment that evening, an apparent suicide. The maintenance worker who had shown them the tunnel was discovered at the bottom of a construction site, the victim of a tragic accident. Anyone who might have knowledge of the breach was systematically silenced. But Park's most ruthless move was what he did to the prisoners who had spoken to Chen. Young and the other survivors who had provided testimony were dragged to the central courtyard and subjected to tortures that made their previous suffering look merciful. Park wanted to know exactly what they had told the journalist, what evidence they had provided, what names they had revealed. But more than that, he wanted to send a message to any other potential witnesses. This is what happens to people who talk to outsiders. Jung endured 3 days of continuous torture without revealing a single detail about his conversation with Chen. They broke his fingers, burned his skin with acid, and subjected him to psychological torments that pushed him to the edge of madness. But he never broke, because Jung understood something that Park didn't. The truth was already free. Whatever happened to him now, the evidence was out there, beyond Park's reach, beyond his control. His suffering had meaning now, in a way it never had before. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen was running for her life through the mountains of South Korea, carrying evidence that could change the world if she could just get it to safety. Chen had anticipated that leaving the country would be difficult, so she had prepared multiple escape routes. Her original plan was to drive to Seoul and catch a flight to Tokyo, but the roadblocks made that impossible. Her backup plan was to reach the port city of Busan and board a cargo ship, but the coastal areas were crawling with security forces. So she activated her final contingency, a network of South Korean dissidents who had been fighting against the military dictatorship for years. These were people who understood the stakes, who had their own reasons for wanting to expose government corruption, and who had developed sophisticated methods for moving people and information across borders. The network was led by a woman named Kim Min-jung, a former university professor who had been blacklisted for her political activities. Kim had been investigating rumors about Brothers' home for years, but had never been able to gather concrete evidence. When Chen contacted her with proof of the facility's crimes, Kim immediately mobilized her entire organization to help. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to smuggle Chen out of the country, they would hide her in plain sight while they copied and distributed her evidence through multiple channels. Chen was given a new identity as a Canadian English teacher working in Seoul. Her appearance was altered with hair dye and colored contact lenses. Her evidence was digitized and encrypted, then transmitted to contacts in Japan, Hong Kong, and the United States through a network of underground computer bulletin boards. But the most brilliant part of the plan was the decoy operation. While Chen was hiding in Seoul, Kim's network spread rumors that the foreign journalist was trying to escape through the DMZ into North Korea. They planted false evidence, created fake sightings, and even staged a dramatic chase scene near the border that convinced Park security forces they were pursuing the real target. For 2 weeks, hundreds of agents scoured the border region looking for Sarah Chen while she sat in a small apartment in Seoul, working with Kim's team to prepare her evidence for publication. But they weren't just copying documents and photographs. They were building a comprehensive case that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. They cross-referenced Chen's evidence with testimony from other sources, financial records that showed the flow of money into Brothers' home, and government documents that proved official knowledge of the facility's crimes. Most importantly, they were preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Kim knew that once this story broke, Park and his allies would do everything possible to discredit the evidence and silence the witnesses. So they created multiple backup copies of everything, distributed them to journalists and human rights organizations around the world, and prepared detailed rebuttals to every possible denial or excuse. They were building a case so airtight, so thoroughly documented, so widely distributed that no amount of money or political pressure could make it disappear. But while Chen and Kim were preparing their bombshell revelation, Park was implementing the final phase of Operation Clean Slate. Realizing that the security breach meant his timeline had been accelerated, Park ordered the immediate execution of all remaining prisoners at Brothers' home. The killing began on December 30th, 1987, and continued for 72 hours straight. The methods were industrial in their efficiency. Prisoners were herded into sealed buildings and killed with poison gas. Others were shot in mass executions and buried in pre-dug graves. The youngest children were given lethal injections, and their bodies were incinerated in specially constructed furnaces. Jung was among the last to die. Park wanted to interrogate him personally one final time to extract every possible detail about what he had told the foreign journalist. But Jung had nothing left to give except his defiance. "You can kill me," he told Park during his final interrogation. "You can kill all of us, but you can't kill the truth. The world is going to know what you did here." Park smiled coldly. "The world will know what I want them to know. And what I want them to know is that Brothers' Home was a successful rehabilitation program that helped thousands of people rebuild their lives. You and your friends were just criminals who died of natural causes." Jung laughed, a sound that was more terrifying than any scream. "You still don't understand, do you? It's too late. The truth is already out there. And when it comes to light, everyone will know what kind of monster you really are." Those were Jung's last words. He died on January 2nd, 1988, just 6 months before the Seoul Olympics began. But his prediction proved to be accurate. On January 15th, 1988, Sarah Chen's story was published simultaneously in newspapers across the United States, Europe, and Asia. The headline read, "South Korea's Secret Death Camps: How Thousands Were Tortured and Killed in Olympic Preparation." The story included photographs that shocked the world: emaciated prisoners, mass graves, medical experiments, and the faces of children who had been tortured to death. It included detailed testimony from survivors, financial records showing government funding, and a complete list of the VIP guests who had paid to watch people die. Most damning of all, it included secretly recorded conversations between Park In-kun and government officials discussing the disposal of prisoners and the cover-up of their crimes. The international reaction was immediate and devastating. The Olympic Committee threatened to move the Games to another country. Foreign governments recalled their ambassadors. International businesses canceled billions of dollars in contracts and investments. But the most powerful reaction came from the South Korean people themselves. When they learned what had been done in their name with their tax money to prepare for their moment of international glory, They took to the streets in numbers that hadn't been seen since the Korean War. The protests began in Seoul but quickly spread across the country. Millions of people demanded answers, justice, and the immediate arrest of everyone involved in the brothers' home atrocity. The government's attempts to dismiss the story as foreign propaganda only fueled the anger. Park In-kun was arrested on January 20th, 1988, just 5 days after the story broke. But his arrest was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape South Korean society. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Dozens of government officials were implicated, including cabinet ministers and Supreme Court justices. Major corporations were exposed as having used slave labor from Brothers' Home. International pharmaceutical companies were revealed to have conducted illegal human experiments. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the extent of foreign involvement. The list of VIP guests who had attended the special events at Brothers' Home included diplomats from the United States, Japan, and several European countries. These officials had not only known about the atrocities, but had actively participated in them. The diplomatic fallout was unprecedented. Several governments fell as their involvement in Brothers' Home was exposed. International relationships that had taken decades to build were destroyed overnight. The entire global order seemed to shift as the true cost of South Korea's economic miracle was revealed. And through it all, the voices of the dead echoed in the testimony that Jung and the other survivors had preserved. Their names were read aloud in courtrooms, their stories were told in newspapers, their suffering was finally acknowledged by a world that had ignored them for too long. The Seoul Olympics went ahead as scheduled, but they were forever marked by the shadow of Brothers' Home. Every medal ceremony, every celebration, every moment of national pride was haunted by the knowledge of what had been sacrificed to make it possible. Park In-kun was sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, but he never served his sentence. On the night before his execution, he was found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. His final note contained just 4 words: "The games never end." Many believed he had been silenced to prevent him from revealing even more damaging information about his powerful allies. Others thought he had simply chosen to escape justice one final time, but Jung's prediction had come true. The truth had survived. The world knew what had happened at Brothers' Home, and the people responsible were finally being held accountable. Or so it seemed. Because while Park In-kun was dead and many of his accomplices were in prison, the system that had made Brothers' Home possible was still intact. The networks of corruption, the culture of impunity, the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the benefit of the powerful, all of these remained. And in countries around the world, other facilities like Brothers' Home continued to operate, hidden from view, protected by powerful interests, waiting for their own Sarah Chen to expose their secrets. The games, as Park had written, never really end. They just move to new locations, find new victims, and adapt to new circumstances. But Jung's legacy lived on too. His courage, his determination to bear witness, his refusal to let the truth die with him, these became an inspiration to people fighting injustice everywhere. Because he had proven something that tyrants and torturers never want their victims to know, that even in the darkest places, even under the most impossible circumstances, the truth can survive. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to carry it, the truth can change the world. The question that remained was, how many more brothers' homes were out there, waiting to be exposed? How many more Jungs were suffering in silence, hoping that someone, somewhere, would care enough to listen to their stories? The answer to those questions would determine whether Jung's sacrifice had truly meant something, or whether the games would simply continue in new forms, with new victims, forever. You want to know the most terrifying thing about the Brothers' Home scandal? It wasn't that it happened. It was how quickly the world moved on. By the time the Seoul Olympics began in September 1988, just 8 months after Sarah Chen's explosive revelations, the international media had largely stopped covering the story. The trials were relegated to back pages. The investigations were quietly scaled back, and the powerful people who had enabled Park and Koon's empire of horror began the slow process of rehabilitating their reputations. Because here's what Jung and the other victims never understood. The truth doesn't automatically lead to justice. Sometimes it just leads to better cover-ups. The man who orchestrated this whitewashing campaign was someone we haven't met yet. Someone who makes Park and Koon look like a small-time criminal. His name was Choi Tae-min, and he wasn't just a government official or a business leader. He was something far more dangerous, a true believer who saw Brothers Home not as a crime, but as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of South Korea. Choi had been one of the original architects of the vagrant cleanup program that led to Brothers Home's creation. But unlike Park, who was motivated primarily by greed, Choi was driven by ideology. He genuinely believed that South Korea's transformation into a modern, prosperous nation required the elimination of undesirable elements from society. In his mind, the people who died at Brothers Home weren't victims. They were casualties in a war for South Korea's future. And wars, as any general will tell you, require sacrifices. When the scandal broke, Choi didn't panic like the others. Instead, he saw an opportunity. The exposure of Brothers Home had created a crisis, but crises could be managed. Public outrage could be channeled, and the narrative could be controlled. Choi's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. Instead of denying that atrocities had occurred, he acknowledged them, but reframed them as the actions of a few rogue individuals who had betrayed the noble goals of the welfare system. Park and Koon became the perfect scapegoat. He was portrayed as a corrupt administrator who had perverted a well-intentioned program for his own profit. The government officials who had enabled him were described as naive bureaucrats who had been deceived by his lies. The business leaders who had invested in the operation were painted as unwitting victims of his fraud. The narrative was simple and compelling. Brothers Home was a tragedy, but it was an aberration. The system itself was sound. It had just been corrupted by bad actors who were now being brought to justice. This narrative was pushed through every available channel. Government-friendly journalists wrote articles about the lessons learned from the Brothers Home scandal. Academic conferences were held to discuss reforms to the welfare system. International observers were invited to tour the improved facilities that had replaced Brothers Home. Most importantly, the survivors were systematically silenced. The few prisoners who had escaped or been released before the final massacre were offered generous compensation packages in exchange for their silence. Those who refused were subjected to harassment, intimidation, and in some cases, mysterious accidents. The families of the victims were given similar offers. They could receive substantial financial settlements, but only if they agreed never to speak publicly about what had happened to their loved ones. Many accepted these deals. After years of poverty and suffering, the money was too tempting to refuse. Others were simply too traumatized to fight a system that had already destroyed their lives once. But some refused to be bought or intimidated, and their stories revealed the true scope of what happened after Brothers Home was exposed. Take the case of Mrs. Park, no relation to Park In-kun, whose 14-year-old son had been kidnapped and killed at Brothers Home. When she refused to accept the government's settlement offer, strange things began happening to her. Her apartment was burglarized repeatedly, but nothing was stolen. The intruders just wanted her to know they could get to her any time. Her phone was tapped, her mail was intercepted, and she was followed wherever she went. When she tried to speak to journalists, she found that her story was never published. When she attempted to testify at trials, she was told that her testimony was not relevant to the proceedings. When she organized protests, the police would arrest her for disturbing the peace. Eventually, Mrs. Park gave up, not because she stopped caring about justice for her son, but because she realized that the system was designed to wear down people like her until they had no fight left. "They didn't need to kill me," she told a human rights investigator years later. "They just needed to make me disappear. And they did." This pattern was repeated hundreds of times across South Korea. Survivors and family members who tried to seek justice found themselves fighting not just individual criminals, but an entire system that was determined to bury the truth. But the most insidious part of Choi's campaign wasn't the intimidation of witnesses. It was the rewriting of history itself. Within 5 years of the brothers' home scandal, the official narrative had been completely transformed. Government textbooks described the facility as a mismanaged welfare institution where some abuses occurred. The thousands of deaths were attributed to poor sanitation and medical care rather than systematic murder. The games that had tortured and killed so many people were either omitted entirely from official accounts or described as recreational activities that had occasionally resulted in accidents. Most remarkably, Park In-kyun himself was gradually rehabilitated in the official narrative. By the mid-1990s, government documents were describing him as a well-intentioned administrator who lost control of his facility, rather than a mass murderer. This revisionist history wasn't just confined to South Korea. International organizations that had initially condemned the brothers' home atrocities began adopting more nuanced positions. The United Nations, which had called for a full investigation in 1988, quietly dropped the matter by 1992. The Olympic Committee, which had threatened to relocate the Seoul Games, eventually praised South Korea's commitment to human rights reform. The pharmaceutical companies that had conducted illegal experiments were allowed to settle their cases out of court with minimal penalties. Even Sarah Chen, the journalist who had exposed the scandal, found her career mysteriously stalled. Her editors began rejecting her follow-up stories about Brothers Home. Her sources dried up. Her credibility was quietly undermined through whisper campaigns that portrayed her as an unreliable sensationalist. By 2000, Chen had left journalism entirely and was working as a college professor in Canada. When students asked her about her most famous story, she would just shake her head and say, "Sometimes the truth isn't enough." But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this cover-up was how it was accomplished without any grand conspiracy or coordinated effort. It happened through the simple mechanism of institutional self-interest. Government officials didn't want to be associated with a scandal that might damage their careers. Business leaders didn't want to be connected to a facility that had used slave labor. International organizations didn't want to admit they had been fooled by South Korea's human rights facade. So they all had reasons to minimize the brothers' home story, to treat it as ancient history, to focus on more constructive topics. No one ordered them to cover up the truth. They just found it convenient to look the other way. This is how atrocities disappear from history. Not through dramatic book burnings or government censorship, but through the gradual erosion of memory, the slow replacement of inconvenient truths with comfortable lies. And it worked. By the time South Korea hosted the World Cup in 2002, most people had forgotten that Brothers Home had ever existed. The country was celebrated as a model of democratic development and economic progress. The dark chapter of the 1980s was treated as a brief aberration in an otherwise inspiring success story. But the system that had created Brothers Home was still intact. The networks of corruption, the culture of impunity, the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the benefit of the powerful, all of these remained. And, sure enough, new scandals began to emerge. Welfare facilities where disabled people were forced to work as slaves. Orphanages where children were sold to foreign adoption agencies. mental hospitals where patients were subjected to experimental treatments without consent. Each scandal followed the same pattern: initial outrage, promises of reform, the punishment of a few scapegoats, and then gradual amnesia as the public moved on to other concerns. The games, as Park and Kuhn had written in his final note, never really ended. They just evolved. But there was one group of people who refused to forget: the children of the survivors. These were the sons and daughters of people who had escaped Brothers' home, or who had lost family members there. They had grown up hearing whispered stories about the games, the torture, the systematic murder of thousands of innocent people. And as they came of age in the 1990s and 2000s, they began to organize. They called themselves the Memory Keepers, and their mission was simple: to preserve the truth about Brothers' home and ensure that it could never be completely erased from history. They collected testimony from survivors who were still alive. They gathered documents that had escaped destruction. They created digital archives that could be distributed around the world. Most importantly, they began telling the stories that their parents had been too traumatized or too intimidated to tell. One of these memory keepers was a young filmmaker named Lee Min-ho, whose father had been imprisoned at Brothers' home for 3 years before escaping during the chaos of the final massacre. Lee's father had never spoken about his experiences, but Lee had grown up seeing the scars on his body, the nightmares that woke him screaming, the way he flinched whenever he heard certain sounds or saw certain symbols. When Lee turned 18, his father finally told him the truth about Brothers' home, and Lee decided to make a documentary about what had happened there. The film, titled The Games We Played, was completed in 2005. Exactly 20 years after the Brothers' home scandal had broken. It featured interviews with survivors, footage of the abandoned facility, and documents that proved the extent of the cover-up. But when Lee tried to distribute the film, he encountered the same obstacles that had silenced so many others. Distributors refused to show it. Film festivals rejected it. Government officials pressured theaters not to screen it. So Lee did something that previous generations of truth-tellers couldn't do. He put the film online. The internet had created new possibilities for preserving and sharing information that couldn't be controlled by traditional gatekeepers. Lee uploaded his documentary to file-sharing networks, video platforms, and social media sites. He encouraged viewers to download it, copy it, and share it with others. Within months, The Games We Played had been viewed by millions of people around the world. It sparked new investigations, inspired other documentaries, and reignited international interest in the Brothers' home scandal. But more importantly, it proved that the truth could survive even the most sophisticated cover-up campaigns. As long as there were people willing to remember, to document, and to share their stories, the victims of Brothers' home would not be forgotten. The memory keepers had won a crucial victory, but they also understood that their work was far from over. Because while they had succeeded in preserving the truth about Brothers' home, they had also discovered something even more disturbing. Facilities like Brothers' home were still operating around the world. In China, there were re-education camps where ethnic minorities were subjected to torture and forced labor. In North Korea, there were political prison camps where entire families were imprisoned for the crimes of their relatives. In the United States, there were immigration detention centers where children were separated from their parents and held in conditions that violated international law. The games that had been played at Brothers' home were still being played, just in different locations, with different victims, under different names, and that realization led the memory keepers to a disturbing conclusion. Brothers' home wasn't an aberration. It was a template, a proof of concept that showed how modern societies could systematically eliminate unwanted populations while maintaining the facade of civilization. The question that haunted them was, how many other Brothers' homes were out there, hidden from view, protected by powerful interests, waiting for their own young to bear witness to their crimes? The answer to that question would determine whether the sacrifices made by the victims of Brothers Home had any lasting meaning, or whether their deaths were just the opening moves in a much larger and more terrifying game. A game that was still being played all around the world, every single day. What happens when the children of survivors grow up and discover that the nightmare their parents escaped is still happening? What happens when they realize that Brothers Home wasn't the end of the story, but just the beginning of a global network of facilities designed to make inconvenient people disappear? The answer came in 2010, when Lee Min-ho received a message that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's ordeal. The message came from an unexpected source, a former CIA analyst named David Morrison, who had been investigating human trafficking networks in Southeast Asia. Morrison had seen Lee's documentary about Brothers Home and recognized disturbing parallels to facilities he had discovered in his own research. "Your father's story isn't unique," Morrison wrote. "What happened at Brothers Home is happening right now in dozens of countries to hundreds of thousands of people. And the same people who covered up Brothers Home are involved in covering up these new facilities." Morrison's evidence was overwhelming. He had satellite images of compounds in remote areas of Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos that bore striking resemblances to Brothers Home. He had financial records showing money flowing from the same international networks that had funded Park In-kun's operation. Most damning of all, he had testimony from survivors who described games and tortures that were identical to those used at Brothers Home. But Morrison's most shocking revelation was about the scope of the operation. Brothers Home hadn't been an isolated experiment. It had been a pilot program, a testing ground for techniques that were now being used on a global scale. The network Morrison had uncovered was vast and sophisticated. It included government officials, business leaders, and criminal organizations from dozens of countries. They called themselves the Consortium, and their business model was simple: identify populations that governments wanted to eliminate, offer to make them disappear, and profit from their suffering. The victims were always the same: refugees, ethnic minorities, political dissidents, the homeless, the mentally ill, anyone who was seen as a burden on society or a threat to the established order. They would be rounded up under various pretexts: immigration violations, public health concerns, national security threats, and transported to remote facilities, where they would be subjected to the same games and tortures that had been perfected at Brothers Home. But the modern version of these facilities was even more sophisticated than Park In-kun's operation. They used advanced surveillance technology to monitor prisoners, experimental drugs to control behavior, and sophisticated propaganda campaigns to justify their existence to the outside world. Most importantly, they had learned from Brothers Home's mistakes. Instead of concentrating operations in a single massive facility, they distributed them across multiple smaller sites. Instead of relying on local corruption, they built international networks that could protect them from any single government's interference. And instead of leaving witnesses alive, they perfected methods of elimination that left no trace. Morrison's investigation had taken him to facilities in 12 different countries, and he estimated that the network was responsible for the disappearance of over 500,000 people in the past decade alone. "They've industrialized genocide," Morrison told Lee during their first meeting. "They've turned the systematic elimination of human beings into a profitable business model that operates across borders and beyond the reach of any single government." But Morrison had more than just evidence. He had a plan. Working with a network of journalists, human rights investigators, and former intelligence operatives, Morrison had been building a case that could expose the entire consortium. But he needed something that Brothers Home had provided and that modern facilities had eliminated: living witnesses. The problem was that the new facilities were designed to leave no survivors. Unlike Brothers Home, where some prisoners had escaped or been released, the modern operations were hermetically sealed. People went in, but they never came out, except for one facility. Morrison had discovered a compound in northern Myanmar that appeared to be experiencing internal problems. Satellite imagery showed signs of unrest, fires, damaged buildings, what looked like escape attempts. Intelligence sources suggested that the facility's management was in chaos and that security had been compromised. If they could get someone inside that facility, document what was happening there, and extract witnesses who could testify about the broader network, they might be able to expose the entire operation. It was an incredibly dangerous plan. Anyone caught infiltrating the facility would almost certainly be killed, and even if they succeeded in gathering evidence, they would be up against an organization with unlimited resources and connections at the highest levels of government around the world. But Lee didn't hesitate. His father had spent 25 years living with the trauma of what he had witnessed at Brother's home. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the guilt of surviving when so many others had died. It had consumed his life. If there was a chance to prevent other families from experiencing that same trauma, Lee was willing to take any risk. The mission began in March 2011. Lee, Morrison, and a team of 6 other investigators entered Myanmar, posing as documentary filmmakers working on a project about rural development. They had legitimate press credentials, official government permits, and a cover story that had been carefully constructed to withstand scrutiny. But their real destination was a facility known only as Site 47, a compound hidden in the mountains near the Chinese border, where an estimated 2,000 people were being held. The journey to Site 47 took 3 days through some of the most remote terrain in Southeast Asia. They traveled by jeep, motorcycle, and finally on foot through dense jungle that seemed designed to discourage visitors. When they finally reached the facility, what they found exceeded their worst expectations. Site 47 was Brother's home, perfected. The compound was larger, more sophisticated, and more brutal than anything Park and Kun had ever imagined. The prisoners wore the same blue tracksuits, lived in the same overcrowded dormitories, and were subjected to the same deadly games. But the games themselves had evolved. The operators of Site 47 had studied the techniques used at Brother's home and refined them with 25 years of additional experience. There was the maze, where prisoners were forced to navigate a complex labyrinth while being hunted by guards with electric prods. There was the pyramid, where people had to climb a structure made of other prisoners while avoiding falling spikes. There was the carousel, where victims were strapped to a spinning platform and subjected to various tortures until they lost consciousness. But the most horrific innovation was something called the family game. Prisoners who had been captured together, parents and children, husbands and wives, siblings, were forced to compete against each other in contests where the loser would be killed in front of their loved ones. Lee watched through hidden cameras as a mother was forced to choose which of her 2 young children would die. He documented a father being made to torture his own son to save his daughter's life. He recorded the screams of families being torn apart for the entertainment of guards who placed bets on the outcomes. But Site 47 wasn't just a torture facility. It was a research center. The operators were conducting experiments on the prisoners, testing new methods of psychological control, developing more efficient ways to break human spirits. They were creating a manual for the systematic dehumanization of entire populations, and they were preparing to export these techniques to facilities around the world. Lee and his team spent 5 days documenting the horrors of Site 47. They gathered hundreds of hours of video evidence, thousands of photographs, and detailed testimony from prisoners who had somehow managed to survive the games. But on their final night at the facility, disaster struck. One of the guards discovered their hidden cameras and raised the alarm. Within minutes, the compound was in lockdown and search teams were scouring the area for intruders. Lee and Morrison managed to escape with most of their evidence, but 3 members of their team were captured. The investigators watched helplessly from the jungle as their colleagues were dragged into the compound and subjected to tortures that made the regular games look merciful. The captured team members died without revealing the identities of their companions or the location of the evidence they had gathered. Their sacrifice saved the mission, but it came at a cost that would haunt the survivors forever. When Lee finally made it back to civilization, he was carrying evidence that could expose a global network of genocide, but he was also carrying the weight of knowing that his investigation had cost 3 people their lives. The question was, would their sacrifice mean anything? Would the evidence be enough to bring down the consortium? Or would the same forces that had covered up Brothers' Home find a way to bury this truth as well? The answer would depend on whether the world had learned anything from the Brothers' Home scandal, or whether humanity was doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Lee was about to find out just how deep the conspiracy went, and how far the consortium would go to protect their secrets. Because the evidence he had gathered didn't just expose Site 47, it revealed connections to facilities in countries that were supposed to be allies, governments that were supposed to be democratic, and organizations that were supposed to protect human rights. The games weren't just being played in remote corners of the developing world. They were being played everywhere, by everyone, all the time. And the people responsible had learned the most important lesson from Brothers' Home. The best way to hide a crime isn't to deny it happened, but to make sure no one cares when it does. The real test wasn't whether Lee could expose the truth. The real test was whether anyone would listen when he did, and whether anyone would be brave enough to act on what they learned. The fate of hundreds of thousands of people hung in the balance, and time was running out. Because while Lee had been documenting the horrors of Site 47, the consortium had been expanding their operations. New facilities were being built. New victims were being selected. New games were being designed. The nightmare that had begun at Brothers' Home was spreading across the globe like a virus. And unless someone found a way to stop it, the games would continue until there was no one left to play them. The question was, who would be brave enough to stand up to an organization that had already proven it would kill anyone who threatened its existence? The answer would determine whether Jung's sacrifice at Brothers' Home had any lasting meaning, or whether his death was just the first move in a game that would never end. You know what's more terrifying than discovering a global network of torture facilities? Discovering that the people running them aren't hiding in shadows. They're sitting in boardrooms, attending charity galas, and giving speeches about human rights at the United Nations. When Lee Min-ho returned from Myanmar with evidence of Site 47, he thought the hardest part was over. He had the proof. He had the documentation. He had testimony from survivors that could bring down the entire consortium. What he didn't anticipate was that exposing the truth would be infinitely more dangerous than gathering it. The first sign of trouble came when Lee tried to contact the journalists who had helped expose Brothers' Home 25 years earlier. One by one, he discovered they were either dead, missing, or had mysteriously abandoned their careers in investigative journalism. Sarah Chen, the reporter who had broken the original Brothers' Home story, had died in a car accident in 2009. The official report blamed mechanical failure, but the timing was suspicious. Just weeks after she had begun investigating reports of new facilities in Southeast Asia. Other journalists who had covered the scandal had suffered similar fates. Heart attacks, suicides, accidents that seemed just plausible enough to avoid suspicion, but occurred with statistical impossibility among people who had all worked on the same story. The message was clear. The consortium had learned from their mistakes. They weren't just covering up their current operations. They were systematically eliminating anyone who might connect their new facilities to the old ones. But Lee pressed forward. He reached out to human rights organizations, thinking they would be eager to expose such massive violations. Instead, he encountered a wall of bureaucratic indifference that was more chilling than outright hostility. The organizations would schedule meetings, express concern, promise to investigate, and then nothing would happen. Weeks would pass without follow-up. Phone calls wouldn't be returned. Emails would disappear into digital black holes. When Lee finally managed to corner one human rights director at a conference, the man's explanation was brutally honest. "We know about facilities like the one you documented. We've known for years, but exposing them would implicate governments that fund our operations, corporations that donate to our causes, and individuals who sit on our boards. We can't bite the hand that feeds us." The director leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Besides, who do you think would replace the current system if we brought it down? At least now we can negotiate for slightly better conditions, marginally less brutal treatment. If we expose everything, they'll just create something worse and make sure there are no witnesses next time." This was the most insidious part of the consortium strategy. They had co-opted the very organizations that were supposed to protect their victims. Human rights groups, international aid organizations, even some government agencies had been gradually infiltrated or compromised until they served the interests of the oppressors rather than the oppressed. It wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and more effective. The consortium had created a system where doing the right thing was always slightly more difficult, slightly more expensive, slightly more risky than looking the other way. They didn't need to bribe officials or threaten activists. They just needed to make sure that the path of least resistance always led away from the truth. But Lee's most shocking discovery came when he tried to trace the financial networks that funded the consortium's operations. Using the documents he had gathered at Site 47, he began following the money trail that connected the facility to its backers. What he found was a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and investment funds that led back to some of the most respected institutions in the world. Pension funds that managed retirement savings for millions of workers, university endowments that funded scholarships and research, charitable foundations that claimed to fight poverty and injustice. All of them were unknowingly, or in some cases knowingly, investing in the systematic torture and murder of innocent people. The consortium had weaponized the global financial system itself. They had made their operations so deeply embedded in the world economy that exposing them would cause massive financial disruption. Retirement accounts would lose value. Universities would face budget crises. Charities would be forced to cut programs. The victims of the consortium weren't just the people in the facilities. They were everyone who depended on the financial systems that the consortium had infiltrated. This was the ultimate protection racket. If you expose us, you'll hurt yourselves more than you'll hurt us. But Lee's investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth. The consortium wasn't just profiting from the elimination of unwanted populations. They were actively creating the conditions that made such elimination seem necessary. Through a network of think tanks, media companies, and political organizations, they were promoting ideologies that dehumanized their target populations. They funded research that proved certain ethnic groups were genetically inferior. They sponsored media campaigns that portrayed refugees as threats to national security. They supported politicians who promised to solve social problems through the elimination of undesirable elements. They were manufacturing the hatred and fear that justified their existence. The brothers' home model had been perfected into something far more sophisticated than Park In-kun had ever imagined. It wasn't just a business. It was a self-perpetuating system that created its own demand. And at the center of this system was a man who made Park In-kun look like an amateur. His name was Marcus Blackwood, and he was the closest thing the consortium had to a public face. Officially, he was the CEO of a humanitarian organization called the Global Stability Initiative. Unofficially, he was the architect of the modern genocide industry. Blackwood was everything Park In-kun had aspired to be: wealthy, respected, connected to the highest levels of power in governments around the world. He gave speeches at the World Economic Forum about sustainable development. He advised the United Nations on refugee policy. He was regularly featured on magazine covers as one of the world's most influential philanthropists. And he was personally responsible for the deaths of more people than any individual in human history. Lee's investigation revealed that Blackwood had been involved in the brothers' home cover-up from the beginning. As a young State Department official in the 1980s, he had helped coordinate the international response to the scandal, ensuring that it was contained and eventually forgotten. But Blackwood had learned from Brothers Home's mistakes. Instead of creating a single massive facility that could be exposed by one brave journalist, he had built a distributed network of smaller sites that were harder to detect and easier to deny. Instead of relying on the local corruption, he had created international partnerships that made exposure politically impossible. Instead of leaving witnesses alive, he had perfected elimination techniques that left no trace. Most importantly, he had learned to hide in plain sight. The Global Stability Initiative operated openly, with offices in major cities around the world. They published annual reports, held press conferences, and maintained websites that detailed their humanitarian work. And it was all true. The GSI did provide disaster relief, did help refugees, did fund development projects in poor countries. But these legitimate activities served as cover for their real business, the systematic elimination of populations that governments wanted to disappear. The same trucks that delivered food aid would return loaded with prisoners destined for facilities like Site 47. The same personnel who provided medical care would also conduct experiments on unwilling subjects. The same communications networks that coordinated humanitarian operations would also manage the logistics of mass murder. Blackwood had created the perfect crime, genocide disguised as charity. But Lee's investigation had revealed something that even Blackwood didn't know. The consortium was planning something that would make Brothers Home and Site 47 look like small-scale experiments. Hidden in the financial documents Lee had obtained was evidence of a project called Operation Clean Slate, the same name Park In-kun had used for his plan to eliminate all witnesses to Brothers Home. But this new clean slate was far more ambitious. The consortium was planning to eliminate not just thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, but entire populations that they deemed incompatible with global stability. The target list was staggering. Ethnic minorities in China, refugees in Europe, indigenous peoples in South America, the homeless in major cities around the world. Anyone who didn't fit into the consortium's vision of an orderly, profitable global society. The plan was to be implemented gradually over the next decade, using a combination of engineered conflicts, manufactured disasters, and systematic elimination campaigns. The victims would be portrayed as casualties of war, natural disasters, or their own poor choices. The world would mourn their deaths while secretly celebrating their disappearance. And when it was over, the consortium would have created a world where only the useful people remained. A global society optimized for profit and control, where dissent was impossible because dissenters no longer existed. It was the ultimate evolution of the Brothers Home model, not just the elimination of unwanted individuals, but the reshaping of humanity itself. Lee realized that he wasn't just investigating a crime, he was uncovering a plan for the future of the human race, and that plan was already being implemented. The question was, could he find a way to stop it before it was too late? The answer would require him to do something that no previous investigator had attempted, not just expose the consortium, but destroy it from within. Because Lee had discovered something that even Marcus Blackwood didn't know. There were people inside the consortium who were having second thoughts about Operation Clean Slate, people who had joined the organization believing they were doing humanitarian work, only to discover the true nature of their employer. These potential allies were scattered throughout the consortium's network, hidden among the true believers and willing collaborators. They were doctors who had been horrified by the experiments they were asked to conduct. They were logistics coordinators who had realized what their supply chains were really transporting. They were financial analysts who had figured out where the money was really going. They were the consortium's greatest vulnerability, people with access, knowledge, and consciences. If Lee could find them, organize them, and convince them to act, he might be able to do what no outside force could accomplish, bring down the consortium from within. But he would have to move quickly. Operation Clean Slate was already beginning, and every day of delay meant more deaths, more suffering, more steps toward a future where the games would never end. The final phase of Lee's investigation was about to begin, and this time, the stakes weren't just the lives of the people in the facilities. They were the future of human civilization itself. The question was, in a world where the most powerful people had decided that genocide was profitable, could one man with a camera and a conscience make any difference at all? The answer would determine whether Jung's sacrifice at Brothers' home had been the beginning of the end for facilities like it, or just the opening move in a game that would consume the entire world. Time was running out, the games were escalating, and the final round was about to begin. 27 years after Jung died clutching the truth about Brothers' home, his words echoed in a conference room in Geneva, where the fate of humanity was being decided by people who had never known hunger, never felt fear, never watched their friends die for someone else's entertainment. Lee Min-ho sat in that room, surrounded by representatives from 12 countries, holding a tablet that contained enough evidence to bring down governments and destroy the most powerful criminal organization in human history. But as he looked around the table at faces that showed polite interest rather than moral outrage, he realized that Jung had been wrong about one thing. The truth doesn't automatically set you free. Sometimes it just shows you how deep the prison really goes. "Mr. Lee," said the Swiss representative, a woman whose manicured nails had never been broken by desperate clawing at concrete walls. "While your documentation is concerning, we must consider the broader implications of acting on this information." The broader implications. That's what they called it when they meant that stopping genocide might be inconvenient for their economies. Lee had spent 3 years building his case against the consortium. 3 years of following money trails, documenting atrocities, and gathering testimony from the few survivors who had escaped facilities like Site 47. He had evidence of systematic murder on a scale that dwarfed the Holocaust. He had financial records proving that respected institutions were profiting from human suffering. He had recordings of Marcus Blackwood himself discussing Operation Clean Slate. And the response from the international community was a collective shrug. "The problem," explained the American representative, a man who probably spent more on lunch than most people made in a year, "is that many of these facilities are located in sovereign nations. We can't simply invade countries based on allegations, no matter how well documented. Allegations. As if the screams Lee had recorded were just hearsay. As if the bodies he had photographed were just rumors." But Lee had expected this response. He had learned from Sarah Chen's experience 27 years earlier, when the brothers' home revelations had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and diplomatic convenience. This time, he had prepared for the inevitable betrayal by the very institutions that claimed to protect human rights. This time, he had a different plan. "I understand your concerns," Lee said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. "That's why I'm not asking you to act on this information." The representatives looked confused. If he wasn't asking for action, why had he called this meeting? "I'm here to inform you that the information has already been released," Lee continued. 12 hours ago, everything I've shown you was uploaded to every major news outlet, social media platform, and file sharing network in the world. By now, millions of people have seen the evidence. The story is already spreading faster than you can contain it. The room erupted in angry voices. Accusations of irresponsibility, threats of legal action, demands to know how he had obtained classified information. But Lee just sat quietly, watching their panic with the same detached interest that VIP guests had once shown while watching prisoners die at Brothers' home. Because Lee had learned the most important lesson from Jung's sacrifice, the truth doesn't need permission to spread. It just needs people brave enough to share it. The evidence Lee had released wasn't just documentation of past crimes. It was a real-time expose of ongoing operations. Hidden cameras that Lee's network had placed in facilities around the world were broadcasting live footage of the games, the torture, the systematic murder of innocent people. Viewers could watch guards forcing children to fight each other to the death. They could see prisoners being subjected to medical experiments that would have made Nazi doctors proud. They could witness the casual brutality of a system that had turned human suffering into entertainment for the wealthy. But more importantly, they could see the faces of the people responsible. Lee's investigation had identified not just the operators of individual facilities, but the entire network of politicians, business leaders, and international officials who enabled the consortium's operations. Their names, photographs, and detailed records of their involvement were now public knowledge. The Swiss representative was frantically typing on her phone, probably trying to contact her superiors. The American was already heading for the door, muttering about damage control. One by one, the other representatives filed out of the room, leaving Lee alone with his tablet and his memories of Jung's final words. "The world is going to know what you did here." Jung had been right. The world did know. The question was, what would they do about it? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Within hours of Lee's evidence going public, protests erupted in major cities around the world. Not the polite, organized demonstrations that governments could easily ignore, but spontaneous explosions of rage from people who had finally seen the true face of the system that ruled their lives. In Seoul, protesters surrounded the offices of companies that had invested in the consortium. In London, they blockaded the homes of politicians who had protected the facilities. In New York, they occupied the headquarters of the Global Stability Initiative, demanding Marcus Blackwood's immediate arrest. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source: the families of the consortium's victims. For decades, these families had been isolated, silenced, and ignored. They had been told their loved ones were criminals, terrorists, or simply people who had chosen to disappear. They had been offered money to stay quiet, threatened with violence if they spoke out, or simply dismissed as delusional. But Lee's evidence had given them something they had never had before: proof that their loved ones had been murdered, and the names of the people responsible. Mrs. Park, the mother who had spent 27 years searching for justice for her son's death at Brothers' home, was now 83 years old. She had given up hope of ever seeing the people responsible held accountable. But when she saw Marcus Blackwood's face on the news, identified as one of the architects of the system that had killed her child, something inside her rekindled. She wasn't alone. Across the world, thousands of families who had lost loved ones to the consortium's facilities began organizing. They shared information, coordinated actions, and most importantly, they refused to be silenced anymore. They had nothing left to lose, and that made them the most dangerous enemy the consortium had ever faced. The first crack in the consortium's armor came when Dr. Sarah Kim, a medical researcher who had been conducting experiments at Site 47, walked into a police station in Bangkok and confessed to her crimes. Dr. Kim had joined the Global Stability Initiative, believing she was helping to develop treatments for trauma victims. It wasn't until she arrived at Site 47 that she realized the true nature of her work. By then, she was trapped, threatened with death if she tried to leave, complicit in crimes that would destroy her life if exposed. But Lee's revelations had changed the calculus. If the truth was already public, if the consortium was already exposed, then her only chance of redemption was to cooperate with the authorities. Dr. Kim's testimony opened the floodgates. Within days, dozens of other consortium employees came forward with evidence of their own. Guards who had been forced to participate in the games, administrators who had falsified records, financial officers who had laundered money through legitimate charities. Each confession led to more evidence, more arrests, more pressure on the consortium's leadership. But Marcus Blackwood wasn't going down without a fight. As the walls closed in around him, Blackwood activated what he called the Samson option, a plan to destroy as much evidence as possible while eliminating anyone who could testify against the consortium. Facilities around the world received orders to execute all prisoners immediately and destroy all records. Key witnesses began dying in suspicious accidents. Computer servers containing financial records were destroyed in convenient fires. Blackwood was trying to implement his own version of Operation Clean Slate, not to reshape humanity, but to erase all evidence of his crimes. But he had underestimated the power of the network Lee had built. The memory keepers, the children and grandchildren of Brothers Home survivors, had spent years preparing for this moment. They had created redundant copies of evidence, established secure communication networks, and developed protocols for protecting witnesses. When the consortium tried to destroy evidence, the memory keepers released backup copies. When they tried to silence witnesses, the memory keepers provided protection. When they tried to control the narrative, the memory keepers flooded social media with first-hand accounts from survivors. The battle for truth had become a war, and the memory keepers were winning. The end came not with dramatic arrests or international tribunals, but with something much simpler. Marcus Blackwood's own words. In a final act of desperation, Blackwood agreed to an interview with a major news network, hoping to present his side of the story. He planned to portray himself as a humanitarian who had been misunderstood, a man whose noble goals had been corrupted by subordinates. Instead, he revealed himself to be exactly what Lee's evidence had shown. A man who saw human beings as resources to be managed, problems to be solved, obstacles to be eliminated. "You have to understand," Blackwood said, his composure finally cracking under the interviewer's questions. "These people were going to die anyway. They were refugees, criminals, mental patients, society's waste products. We simply found a way to make their deaths serve a useful purpose." The interviewer, a veteran journalist who had covered wars and disasters around the world, was visibly shaken. "You're talking about human beings, Mr. Blackwood. Children. Families." Blackwood's response was the final nail in his coffin. Children grow up to be problems. Families create emotional attachments that interfere with rational decision-making. The world we were building would have been more efficient, more stable, more prosperous for everyone who mattered. And who decides who matters? Blackwood smiled, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. "We do. We always have." That interview was broadcast around the world, and it destroyed any remaining sympathy for the consortium's cause. Even their most powerful allies abandoned them. Governments that had protected them for decades suddenly discovered a passion for justice. Corporations that had profited from their operations rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Marcus Blackwood was arrested 3 days later, found hiding in a bunker beneath his estate in Switzerland. With him were hard drives containing the complete records of Operation Clean Slate, evidence that would keep prosecutors busy for decades. But the most important discovery wasn't in Blackwood's files. It was in a letter he had written to his successor, a document that revealed the true scope of the consortium's ambitions. "The games we have played," Blackwood had written, "were never about the people who died. They were about the people who watched. Every VIP who paid to see prisoners fight to the death, every official who looked the other way, every citizen who chose comfort over conscience, they all became complicit in our vision of the future. We didn't just eliminate unwanted populations. We eliminated unwanted morality. That was the consortium's true crime, not just the murder of hundreds of thousands of people, but the corruption of the human spirit itself. They had turned ordinary people into accomplices, bystanders into collaborators, and witnesses into participants. They had made the world complicit in its own dehumanization, but Jung's sacrifice and the sacrifices of all the others who had died in facilities like Brothers Home had not been in vain. Their deaths had planted seeds of truth that had grown into a movement powerful enough to bring down the most sophisticated criminal organization in history. The trials that followed would last for years. Hundreds of people would be convicted of crimes against humanity. Billions of dollars would be recovered and distributed to survivors and victims' families. New international laws would be passed to prevent similar organizations from ever forming again. But the most important victory wasn't in the courtrooms or the headlines. It was in the simple fact that the truth had survived. Jung's words, spoken in a torture chamber 27 years earlier, had finally been heard by the world. The world is going to know what you did here. And now they did. The games were over. The truth had won. And the memory of everyone who had died fighting for that truth would live on, ensuring that such horrors could never again be hidden in the shadows. Lee Min-ho stood in the ruins of Site 47, now abandoned and overgrown with jungle vegetation. He placed a small memorial stone on the ground where Jung's father had once searched for his son, where thousands of people had died playing games designed to break their spirits. The inscription on the stone was simple. They remembered everything. They told everyone. They made them pay. It was Jung's promise, finally kept. The games were over. The truth had set them all free. But as Lee walked away from the ruins, he carried with him the knowledge that vigilance was eternal. Somewhere in the world, other people were probably planning new games, new ways to profit from human suffering, new methods of making inconvenient people disappear. The price of freedom, as Jung had learned, was the willingness to bear witness, to remember everything, to tell everyone, and to never, ever stop fighting for the truth. The real-life Squid Games were over, but the fight for human dignity would continue forever. And that was exactly as it should be.